Good afternoon and welcome to Mountain States Legal Foundation Zoom webinar. I'm Sean Paige. I'm the Communications Director at Mountain States, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. We host these online forums to speak directly to our friends and supporters, the public and the press, and to talk about our legal cases and a range of related issues. Mountain States is a nonprofit, public interest legal firm established in 1977 and located outside of Denver, Colorado. We defend clients pro bono in defense of individual liberties protected by our U.S. Constitution. At Mountain States, we believe freedom is worth fighting for. We'll begin today's webinar with a three-way moderated discussion and then open it up to your questions and comments. You can find a place to submit your questions on the bottom marked Q&A button on your screen. Joining us today is Mountain States attorney Brian Gregg, who takes lead on much of our endangered species, grazing rights, and natural resources work. We're also talking today to Jim Magagna. He's the executive vice president of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which has served as the guardian of Wyoming's cow country since 1871. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Happy to be with you.
Focus of today's discussion is the future of the Green River Drift. It's one of the West's largest and most historically significant cattle drives. It has taken place annually in Wyoming since the 1890s. Thousands of cattle from numerous ranches are moved over a 2-week period, nearly 70 miles, from the lower elevation winter range to the higher elevation summer range. The drift isn't a movie set. It isn't an historic reenactment. It's the real deal, an actual cattle drive. It involves real cowboys, real ranchers, and thousands of real cattle, which sometimes get attacked and eaten by real grizzly bears on the Bridger-Teton National Forest. Today's discussion is whether the drift can survive attacks by organized green extremists who aim to deny ranchers their grazing rights by making these areas unsuitable for use due to the heightened risk to cattle and cowhands posed by this thriving but federally protected bear species. Let's open the discussion with our special guest, Jim Magagna, to help us understand what this conflict is really all about. Have I accurately framed the situation up there, Jim?
Well, I believe you have. You know, the use of the drift and the grazing up on the Forest Service has had conflicts throughout the years, driven more by practical considerations than anything else. And it started back in the 1870s. It's fundamental to the industry in that area. And so the drift and the grazing of the Forest Service during the summer months by these cattle operations is critical to their survival. They've changed a lot since those early days in terms of management regimes. They've done a lot of things to enhance the rangelands. They've done things that have enhanced wildlife populations in the area. It's been a very progressive undertaking of ranchers and Forest Service managers and other interests working together up there. And then in more recent years, they faced this attack from the radical environmental groups, some of whom admittedly don't want any livestock up there, so they use whatever tools they can. In this particular case, they're using the presence of the grizzly bear and the need to manage the grizzly bear. But it's a very unique situation, repeats itself in many ways across the state, but the drift itself, and the word is interesting because the cattle are herded up onto the forest, but then in the fall, just driven by the season of the year, they naturally drift down, and the ranchers wait down there and pick them up as they come down. And that was recognized a long time ago, but more recently in 2014, it was recognized when the drift was placed on the National Register of Historic Places as the only ranching related, quote, traditional cultural property. And that's something that we're proud of in Wyoming, and something that I think not only the ranching industry, but the people of Wyoming are dedicated to maintaining.
Interesting history there, Jim. Brian, can you flesh out for us the kind of legal elements of this case?
Absolutely. This case is basically another front in an overarching war about delisting the grizzly bear from the Endangered Species Act. For over a decade now, the federal government and conservation entities have concluded that the grizzly bear has essentially recovered in all but name. All the different criteria for the species recovery has been met, but there's still the formal legal process of actually delisting the bear that needs to happen. And groups such as MSLF and related cases are trying to push for that.
Could you talk a little bit about the related cases? And as I understand it, the bear population has done quite well since the listing, and it's a great success story, but it seems like some people just don't want to take it off the list for all kinds of other reasons.
That's exactly right, because they would lose a significant amount of leverage if they actually use the Endangered Species Act for its intended purpose. In this particular area, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, MSLF has been involved in a related case concerning grizzly bear management. And in fact, last month, I believe there was an argument before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals about this very issue. So this is still very much an ongoing hot button issue, and a lot of it's still up in the air right now.
Jim, talk a little bit more about the ranching business in general. You know, during this COVID-19 thing, we've seen a lot of focus on the food supply chain, and we've seen that the ranchers are having a hard time just getting by. And so talk a little bit about the ranching environment out there today and what it's like. And then from a rancher's perspective, what this means in terms of the drift.
Well, the ranching community in much of the country, and particularly in Wyoming, is facing some almost unprecedented challenges today. And I see it just through my own work. Typically in my position, 80% of my time is spent on dealing with these natural resource issues, whether it's endangered species, public land grazing, water issues, wild horses, etc. That has totally reversed itself in the past 4 months. And I now found that I'm spending 50 to 60% of my time dealing with marketing challenges that our producers are facing. In part, a large part due to the slowdown in processing because of the COVID-19 affecting workers in the major processing plants, and some related challenges with regards to how we market. But so having something like this case put in front of these producers at this time, when they know they're going to get less value for their cattle this year, and then face the threat of having far fewer cattle to market because of the impact of the grizzly bear, really puts a lot of these fourth and fifth generation cattle ranches in financial peril in 2020.
Well, talk about the economics of it a little bit more, in the sense that, what does this mean to a rancher who has their stock up on summer range and begins to lose animals to predators, whether the wolf or the grizzly bear? What kind of economic impacts can that have?
Well, it depends on a number of factors. Of course, they've lost the value of that animal. I do acknowledge we have a very good program in Wyoming at the state level to provide compensation to the ranchers for confirmed losses. But in those very rugged mountain areas with a lot of timber, only a percentage of the losses are ever confirmed. But it goes beyond that, because first of all, I think we can't ignore just the pride in being a successful rancher. If I have 100 head of cows, I want to be able to talk about the percentage of calves I was able to market 6 months later off of those cows. And if 5 or 10%, in some cases even 15% of those animals are consumed by grizzly bears and or wolves in the summer months, even if I'm financially compensated for a percentage of those, there's not much satisfaction to a rancher in saying, I got the money, but I didn't market the animals. We're in the business to care for the land. We're in the business to feed the population, and not to feed grizzly bears and wolves. So it's a financial impact that's significant. Just looking at some numbers in the upper green for that grazing association, back in 2008, when they were already having some wolf problems, but didn't have the grizzlies yet, they had 22 head of confirmed cattle losses for the summer. In 2015, they had 79 head of confirmed cattle losses. That is a huge change and a huge impact. And that's even when they did have some measure of grizzly control and were necessary, some very limited lethal removal. So the idea of going back to a scenario where there's no removal would be devastating and put together with the current economic challenges that the industry is facing. It's hard for me to believe that it may not be fatal to some of those ranching operations. We lose a ranching operation in that area. The only other viable use of that land is often to subdivide it for summer home lots for people, which are very much in demand. So what do we see? We see not only the loss of ranching, we see the loss of wildlife habitat, we see a change in the economy of the local communities over there. The town of Pinedale, which is the center point for this, historically for over 100 years, its economy was a ranching economy. In the early 2000s and for the last 15 years or so, some significant energy development, oil and gas has stepped up and picked up much of that, but that industry is in certainly a decline right now, particularly over in that area. So ranching is the cornerstone of those local economies, and it's the cornerstone to maintaining the wide open spaces that support our wildlife, that support our recreation and tourism industry.
I think it sounds like there's kind of a bait and switch going on. I mean, the take has been allowed, a lethal take of demonstrated nuisance bears has been allowed since 1975, but now what the groups want to do is basically take that down to zero, saying that it's open season on the livestock up on that range and there's no way to remove a problem bear. Is that what's really going on here?
Well, it is from my perspective, and what's kind of hard for me to digest and understand is that back when we had only a very small population of grizzly bears starting to evolve into the area, and they were in fact truly endangered, we weren't getting this litigation. We come 20 years or so later to today, when the grizzly population is strong, the species is by all measures that have been established scientifically, it's fully recovered, and now all of a sudden the remove of a small number of those bears becomes a subject of litigation. So it tells me something beyond bears about the groups that we have that are active today, that have agendas that go far beyond just having the ability to see a grizzly bear or knowing that the Northern Rockies have a heavy population, a healthy population of grizzly bears.
Brian, back to the case itself right now. Where are we in the trajectory of the case, and what rulings are pending, and sort of walk us through the procedural side of this lawsuit?
Sure. So back on March 31st of this year, the plaintiffs, a coalition of some of the most far-left environmental groups in the nation, filed this lawsuit seeking to prevent federal agencies from using lethal take against grizzly bears in this area. Lethal take is basically bureaucrat language for killing problem bears that have known documented conflicts with livestock. And then shortly thereafter, one group of plaintiffs filed what's called a preliminary injunction. An injunction is just an order from a court saying, hey, time out, we're going to press the pause button. We're going to issue an order, in this case saying that Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, you cannot kill problem grizzly bears. And we had a hearing on that preliminary injunction motion last week, and we are expecting a order from the court deciding the outcome of that any day now.
And the case hinges on what kind of legal issues that we're waiting to resolve?
Basically, the sufficiency of the environmental scientific analysis that provides the basis for the federal agency's decision to say you can kill problem bears. That's the gist of it.
It's important to note that that has been going on, and as I understand it, there's you can take a certain amount of demonstrated, documented problem bears over a 10-year period. But again, now they're trying to bring that down to zero. So the ruling that's about to come down, how will that impact? That's a short-term thing. How will it impact the larger case if it does?
So literally right now, all the ranchers in this case, our clients, are in the process of driving their cattle out onto the summer pastures up in the Upper Green River allotment. They will make their way up there in the next couple of weeks. Now, this injunction will not prevent grazing as such, but like you stated earlier, it will create open season on the cattle. Bears will be allowed to kill livestock with impunity, essentially. There'll be no remedy beyond non-lethal and potentially pretty ineffective options for trying to save the herd.
It's important to point out that this isn't just about cattle. There are cowboys, there are range riders up there with the cattle trying to protect them. So there's a human element in the risks involved here too. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jim? How this is all done up there in the high country through the summer months?
Well, certainly, and since the early days, they've had riders up there in the summer to watch over the cattle, to move them to make sure that they're grazing the land in a proper manner. In recent years, since the wolves and the grizzly bears have come in, I believe that Upper Green Grazing Association has more than doubled the number of riders they have up there, because on top of all their usual duties, they have the duty of watching out for the grizzly bears, of identifying cattle that have been killed, and then notifying our wildlife officials so they can come in and verify those kills so that they can be eligible for some compensation. So the intensity of human involvement has increased significantly because of the presence of the grizzly bear, and therefore it's inevitable that we have put those humans at a greater risk because of the grizzly bears being there. And Mr. Summers, who's one of the interveners in this case with us, has personally been the subject of an attempt to be attacked by a grizzly bear. That
oh, really?
Relate that story, and there are others as well. And so we're putting people at risk. There's no doubt about it. And yet, for the safety of the cattle, and for the care of the resource, for the proper management of the resource, it's not an alternative to just turn the cattle loose up there and come home and say, we'll wait for them to come home in 75 days.
Right. And there's a process, involved. It seems like there's two bureaucratic procedures here. There's one to identify, document a case of predation, assuming you can find the carcass. And then there's the removal process itself. It's not like, as I understand it, it's not like a rancher can just go out there and shoot a grizzly bear. Could you walk us through sort of what these ranchers have to do to protect their herds up there?
It's a significant process. First of all, the ranchers can't shoot a grizzly bear. Only the authorities can do that. Secondly, a bear is not lethally removed because it killed an animal. A bear is only lethally removed when there's a demonstration and evidence to establish that that particular bear has evolved into a habit of repeated killings of cattle, or repeated threats to a human, as the case may be. So the bears that qualify for lethal removal are limited to begin with. It's not like every bear that's in the Upper Green is at risk. It's their behavior that determines their level of risk.
Interesting. And this begins this weekend. Ranchers are gonna start to work this drive this coming weekend.
They are doing that, and with a lot of uncertainty given the existence of these cases right now. And in the big picture, they don't have a lot of choice. Those forest permits are an integral part of a 12-month seasonal operation for these ranchers. They have areas that they use in the winter. They feed cattle on feed lines in the winter. They have private lands and BLM leases that they graze on in the spring and until about mid-June here. And then it's not like, gee, I don't want to put my cattle at risk, so I'm not going to take them up there this summer because I have no place else to put them. It's really a matter of I'm going to accept that risk, even though it's potentially lethal to my business, or I'm going to sell the cattle today because I don't have other options.
Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between the ranchers and the grizzly bears. There's some out there that want to make them mortal enemies, locked in perpetual battle, but ranchers are good stewards of the land. Ranchers care about animals. Ranchers care about wildlife, don't they? I mean, they're not just up there wanting to exterminate the grizzly bear.
Oh, they very much care. And you know, the grizzly bear, it's a predator. It's distinct in that sense. But in the broader wildlife sense, it's no different than the elk and the deer and the moose that are up there. And we manage every species of livestock through hunting seasons, through wildlife management type decisions. There's no species, including the cattle, that's just allowed to propagate and without limitations. And now suddenly we've identified one or two species, which are the predators, the wolves and the grizzly bears, that there are those who say, well, you know, they're different. We don't need to have any parameters. It's not only removal of grizzly bears to protect livestock. Wyoming had made all the plans to initiate a very limited grizzly bear hunting season this past year to allow some sportsmen to harvest grizzly bears, and the actions of the court in the other cases that Brian mentioned in that were federal district court in Montana, now in the Ninth Circuit, precluded that from moving forward. So it's a failure to recognize that we all believe in nature and those things are in nature, but nature, as long as there are humans in the area, nature requires a degree of human management.
It's a really good point, the management issue, because it's not just grizzly bear, it's mountain lions, it can be wolves, we manage elk herds, we manage everything else. So why wouldn't we do it with the bear? Brian, can you talk about the larger legal landscape that we're operating in right now in regards to other lawsuits having to do with the grizzly bears, grizzly bear protections?
Well, I mean, really, it hinges on whether or not the bear will be delisted, because, as I mentioned before, scientifically speaking, there's a consensus that it is fully recovered. As you mentioned before, it's a complete success story. And not surprisingly, a big, gnarly apex predator tends to do pretty good as long as humans leave it alone. And over the last several decades, humans have been very intelligent about how exactly they want to foster recovery in the lower 48 states. So fundamentally, this lawsuit is disingenuous because it ignores this underlying fact that they're trying to argue for protections for a species that doesn't need it.
You know, we all acknowledge that the grizzly is an icon of the West, just like the cowboy. I mean, what are the implications for us culturally and historically, Jim, if we turn our back on the cowboys? A lot of people probably think they're just figments of things they've seen in movies, but they're really out there. They're really working. They're really delivering the beef, which turns into the hamburgers that we have in our restaurant, or the steaks. Can you talk about the cultural and historic significance of this cattle drive and ranching in general to the Western way of life?
Well, it's the culture of Wyoming and many of our neighboring Western states, but Wyoming in particular, we are the cowboy state, and that's because ranching and cattle raising and being cowboys and ranchers has been so fundamental to us. But it's more than that. Really, there's no place that cattle are raised with less disturbance of the natural conditions. We're not planting crops for them or anything. We're grazing the forage that naturally is produced there. So there's less disturbance in that sense, and more care of that resource than a lot of foreign nations that have abused their resources through grazing. It's the ideal place, really, to raise cattle to meet the human desire to have those steaks and those burgers on the table. Now, I will say that today, you know, we're hearing more and more, you see more in the media, that we should quit eating red meat and we should get rid of all the cattle. And I see clear evidence that some of those who are anti-red meat and anti-slaughtering livestock, and those who are, quote, radical environmental groups that are anti-grazing. They found some common ground, and they're starting to work together. And I think that poses another challenge that we have to be prepared to deal with.
No doubt about it. I've got a question here from Christopher. Let me read it to you. I presume similar legal challenges have been brought with the introduction of the wolf. Is there any precedent there that will be helpful, if not directive, in defeating the claims Mountain States is fighting? Is there any?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is tons and tons and tons of Endangered Species Act case law, as you might imagine, considering how contentious and complicated an issue it is. Just off the top of my head, one particular line of case law that's going to be helpful in this case is confirmation both in the DC circuit where we're at, and also at the 9th Circuit and the 10th Circuit, that an environmental group's stated interest in an endangered species is limited to the species as a whole. It's not isolated to particular subpopulations or particular areas. So, long story short, the environmentalists here can only be concerned about the grizzly bear as such all across America. And that's really key to this lawsuit, because the plaintiffs are claiming that they have standing to bring this suit because in this particular area, the Upper Green River allotment, this particular area south of Yellowstone National Park, they claim there will be increased lethal take. Well, according to this case law I'm just talking about, that's not legally significant.
Okay. Jim, a little bit of the geography of this. I think Brian just mentioned, for people who aren't familiar with Wyoming as a place, could you give us kind of the lay of the land of where this is all going on, and what part of the state?
Well, it's northwestern Wyoming, excuse me, and most people are familiar with Yellowstone and Teton National Park. It would be south and somewhat east of that. It's actually the Upper Green. These allotments are in the Wind River mountain range, which is the Continental Divide. The Green originates up there and then flows into the Colorado River, and just a few steps over the hill, there are streams that originate up there that end up in the Missouri River and go the other direction. So it's a significant area in that sense.
These are real people with real livelihoods, real families who are running real ranches. Could you talk about who the plaintiffs are in this case?
Well, there's a lot of plaintiffs. It's a coalition of very far left radical environmental groups. The key player in this particular lawsuit is a group called Western Watersheds Project, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners know exactly who and what they are, but their purpose, to be blunt about it, is to end public lands livestock ranching. They want to destroy ranches in the Western U.S. Our clients are on the exact opposite side of that. We are trying to intervene in this lawsuit on the behalf of a coalition of individual ranches and a couple of cattlemen's associations. So Jim here is one of our clients, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, as well as the Upper Green River Cattle Association. They're a regional group of the ranchers who graze on this historic drift trail. And then the individual ranches that we are representing are the Somers Ranch, the Price Cattle Ranch, and the Murdoch Land and Livestock Company. And those three individual ranches are the direct descendants of the people who homesteaded this part of the country back in the 1880s and 1890s.
It's really amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's where the history comes in too, of preserving this amazing legacy and Western way of life. What will happen if we lose the case? I hate to say that, but what will happen if we lose the case?
A lot of these ranches will likely be destroyed, or at least significantly diminished in terms of what they can do. And of course, in a hyper-technical legal standpoint, the plaintiffs aren't saying Forest Service stop this grazing authorization, but what they're saying is there should be no management of problem grizzly bears, essentially. And so consider the bigger picture. Some of these individual ranchers have losses of calves annually as high as 14%, and that's with the ability to kill a problem grizzly bear. Now imagine if you're not allowed to kill a problem grizzly bear, how much higher is that percentage going to be? A quarter, a third? I don't want to speculate, but you get the picture. I mean, imagine you're a business person and you lose a quarter of your inventory every single year. Would you want to stay in business? Could you stay in business? Probably not.
So some of these families have been on this land, working this land for generations. And, you know, we often forget their ties to the land, and they're good conservationists too, aren't they? I mean, don't they care about the land and nature just as much? They live off it. You think that they'd care about it?
You can't be a good rancher if you don't care for the land. One of our biggest points that we always mention here at Mountain States is that ranchers are the real conservationists. In fact, one of our clients, the Somers Ranch, they won a national award from the Aldo Leopold Society, recognizing their stewardship of the Upper Green River.
Now, back to the compensation question for a second, Jim. Now, are these ranchers compensated, assuming they can find the livestock and document a kill? Are they compensated for the full market value of the animal over time and the time and effort that they've taken to raise it from the point that it was born to the point that it goes to the slaughterhouse? How much are they compensated, and is it fair? Is it a fair amount?
Well, I think it's relatively fair under the state program. For those that are identified, the compensation is based on an agreed upon average weight. I believe recent years they've used 500 pounds. I'm speaking of calves now. If it's an adult cow, then that's a different picture. But for calves, which are most of the kills, they're compensated based on that weight. And then each year they look at what fall market prices, when they would normally be marketing those calves, look like, and take an average and calculate a number. So I believe in 2019, as I recall, the compensation was about $585 a head. And then we do have a provision in the state law that because we know that only a relatively small percentage of those animals can be identified, especially with grizzly bears, a wolf will come in and kill and maybe come back again. Grizzly bears tend to eat them. And so on calves, not on adult cattle, but on calves, they are compensated at a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you confirm one kill, you're compensated for 3 head. But now, even with that, they're certainly not made whole. And then that doesn't measure any of the other impacts. You know, these not necessarily are taken care of by removing a few problem bears, but they're helped. These cattle up there with the excess of grizzly bears are being bothered. They're being run around more. They don't pasture in the manner they would. They're more nervous. That has 2 impacts. One, it means smaller weight gains than if they were just calm and pasturing all the time. And 2, it increases the challenge to properly manage the range resource, because if cattle are being bunched up by grizzly bears and run around, there's the potential for some damage to the resource. And that's part of the reason that having that extra labor up there is so critical.
You're a rancher yourself, Jim. Could you tell us what other, we're talking a lot about cattle ranching, but livestock is a bigger category of people. Could you talk a little bit about other impacts of predators on the livestock industry?
Well, certainly, and particularly to the grizzly bears up there, there was a group of 4 sheep allotments right adjacent to the Upper Green cattle allotments that a good friend of mine had for a number of years. Because of the grizzly impacts, one, they were losing significant numbers of sheep. Second, the Forest Service, in trying to minimize the losses, was requiring them to put up electric fencing and fence their sheep in every night. And then they were requiring they always have herders with the sheep, but they were requiring to have more labor involvement. One of their herders was seriously injured by a grizzly bear about 4 years ago. As a result of all of that, 3 years ago, they relinquished those permits. They said it was just no longer feasible for them to continue up there. They've continued to look for places to compensate for that lost summer forage. In fact, they're running part of their sheep on my operation right now, just trying to help them out in the interim basis. It's not as desirable as being up on those high forest lands, but it's enabled them to stay in the business. But the impact with sheep or cattle, I mean, it's the same in both cases. And while I don't have any statistics, talking with people who are outfitters up in that greater Yellowstone area, and that there have been some serious impacts on particularly deer and elk herds.
Interesting. So there are a lot of ancillary effects that happen along the way, and this can have a lot of other impacts.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. You know, we often think we're talking about the rancher, but there is a connection between the rancher and the consumer. And we've talked a little bit about beef. I'm a meat eater, I'll admit it, right here on television, national television.
Thank you.
But no, I mean, do you think Americans have a deep enough appreciation? You know, they just pull through a McDonald's or a Wendy's and they get their product and away they go. And do you think Americans have a deep enough appreciation for what it takes to bring them that bounty and put that bounty on their table? I mean, maybe COVID has sort of waked people up a little bit to the fact that we can actually run out of things. We're not used to that in America, that we could actually run out, we could have shortages of things. Could you talk a little bit about, you know, what it means to the consumer? Let's bring it home to the people who live in Denver or San Francisco, the people who live in urban areas who are a little bit sometimes disconnected from things like the food supply chain.
Well, we spend a lot of time working on delivering that message, because I do think we're into a generation or several generations of people who don't have that connection back to the farm or ranch that historically many of us had. And as a result, we like to say they think that meat comes from Safeway, or you name the food chain, but they don't stop to think the processes that led to that, and to understand that. So it is important. And certainly the groups that we're having to stand up against that Brian's mentioned, when they file these cases, and more importantly, when they seek contributions from the general public to support their litigation, they certainly don't tell the story that this has anything to do with the food in the grocery store or the steaks you can order in the restaurant.
What about those groups, Brian? Who funds the other side? Who is it that's really out to get ranchers in this country? You know, mom and pop environmental groups, or what is it that ranchers are really squaring off with when they fight this battle?
No, these are not mom and pop groups. These are very well funded professional groups that have backing from some of the most powerful people in the country who want to destroy this rural way of life. And as to the question of where do they get their money, frankly, they get it from you. They get it from the American taxpayer through a legal mechanism called the Equal Access to Justice Act. And like so many laws, that law was passed with good intentions. It basically states that, you know, if a, you know, the little guy, quote unquote, if a small organization prevails in a lawsuit against the federal government, they're entitled to their legal fees paid by the American taxpayer. Well, through various sleights of hand that I won't go down the rabbit hole on right now. These groups, these so-called environmental groups, routinely recoup millions and millions of dollars in attorney's fees from the general public, and it's literally a racket. There's actually been some scholarly work trying to expose this, and I remember that in the last couple of years, I believe Fox News ran a special on just exactly how egregious this has gotten.
So there are groups that are actually subsidized. there are groups that are actually subsidized to sue through the Equal Access to Justice, the so-called Equal Access to Justice Act. And that's all they do for a living all the time professionally. Ranchers have to do a lot of other things to defend their turf, right? They've got to be out there running a ranch.
That's exactly right. And they're professional litigation machines.
But that's why we need the help of people out there, especially in urban areas and stuff, to let them know that, it's a tough fight for ranchers. They're definitely the underdogs in this fight. And what Mountain States Legal Foundation does is serve as the equalizer, sort of the David to the giant green Goliath. So that's what we really do out here, and we're proud of that. Jim, anything else you want to kind of wrap up in terms of, the overview points that we haven't hit on, things like that you want the folks out there to know about the Green River Drift or about ranching in general?
Well, yes, but I want to follow up briefly on your last point, because I think that is so critical. And that is, those groups are being funded by the taxpayers through the Equal Access to Justice Act. In the one or two cases in my memory, when we tried to get a court to award us legal fees based on equal access to justice, we were never successful. We were deemed to be the big ag industry. We don't qualify for that. So we would not be able to defend against these challenges if it weren't for public interest law firm like Mountain States Legal Foundation. We've worked with you for many years on endangered species, water, public land grazing. My first interaction with Mountain States, not in my current capacity, was back in the early 80s on a lawsuit over wild horse management. And so to all the people who are watching this, I would just emphasize that if we're going to keep things like the grazing industry and ranching industry viable, we've got to be prepared to fight these lawsuits or they overwhelm us. And we simply don't have the resources as an industry to do that if we didn't have the help of Mountain States Legal and some similar groups, particularly in the West.
That's great. I mean, Jim, we love being of help to you. Brian, can you just, last question, could you just again recount where we are in the process, what's likely to happen next, and what the implications are going down the road as we are about to start on the next Green River Drift?
Yeah, so right now, any day we should be receiving an order from the judge issuing his decision on this preliminary injunction matter. That is appealable, but of course, in the interim, like we've been talking about, the drift is starting right now, so that's going to have huge short-term consequences. Apart from that, we'll be briefing the merits over the summer and early fall, and in fact, there's actually multiple lawsuits about this going on right now, and we're going to seek to transfer this case back to the District of Wyoming where it belongs, and then consolidate all these kind of random squirrely lawsuits into one big one.
Interesting. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today and a lot of bases on the lawsuit. You can learn more about this and our other cases online by visiting the website mslegal.org. That's mslegal.org. We're also on Twitter and Facebook, so please friend and follow us when you get the chance. I want to thank Brian Gregg, Foundation attorney, and our special guest today, Jim Magagna of the Wyoming Stock Growers Group. I'm Sean Paige, Communications Director of Mountain States Legal Foundation. I want to thank all of you who participated and offered your questions today. We hope you'll join us for our next Mountain States Legal Foundation webinar.